Welcome to Clockworks, a Legion podcast. I'm Paul Moffat.
I'm Jan Moffat.
And this is the show where we talk about Legion. We tick-tock about Legion.
Wait, I'm pretty sure you've done that one before.
It was the first one ever.
That's cute.
It's all come round in a big circle, which is another clock joke.
I guess.
Because clocks go in a circle and the hand. We're doing a wrap-up on Season 2. We're going to spend some time talking about the things that we noticed throughout the whole season. We'll talk about the Jon Hamm narrations and what we make of all of that when we put it all together in the context of the whole show. We'll talk about some of the motifs that we noticed through the whole season recurring. We'll talk about some of the themes and big ideas that we think this season was all about. We'll talk about the characters and what we think of the character journey of several of the main characters. We'll talk about some of our favorite moments, episodes, musical numbers. We'll talk about our reactions to our predictions and questions from Season 1. In our Season 1 wrap-up, we made some predictions about what Season 2 would be like, and we're going to look back at that now. And we'll make some predictions for Season 3 and some remaining unanswered questions that we are left with here at the end of Season 2.
That sounds great to me.
All right.
Let's get into it. If we have to divide this show into like several thousand more shows, we might have to do that.
Yeah, depending on, we're sitting down here, unsure. If this goes on too long, we'll break it up into 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 episodes, but it might just be one. We will just have to wait and see.
All right, so let's get into this. I rewatched all of the Jon Hamm parts, so you don't have to. Or rather, maybe you want to. But so I'm just going to start with just like a recap of all of the Jon Hamm narrations, which are not in every episode, but are in most episodes. With lack of a better term, we call them Jon Hamm narrations because that's who narrates them. But do we have a better way of describing them?
I think that's a perfectly fine way of describing them.
All right. So we begin in the very first episode on a black screen where he talks about you're inside the maze and welcome to madness. The second time we get one of these is just a title card, Chapter 2, The Madness of Crowds, which just launches into the episode. Later on that same episode, we get Chapter 3, Delusions, where we hear about Zhuang Zhu, who dreamed he was a butterfly. We hear about Albert A, who cuts off his leg because he feels like it's not his. And the conclusion is, for a delusion to thrive, other more rational ideas must be destroyed. In the next episode, Chapter 10, we get Chapter 4, Umwelt. Reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, it doesn't go away. Is the whole part with the boy who's taught red and green, and we are the only animal on Earth who goes mad. The next episode, Chapter 11, has Part Contagion 5, which introduces the nocebo effect, and what about our reality is disorder. Chapter 12 has no Jon Hamm in that episode. Chapter 13 has the coincidence or conspiracy, Chapter 6. Then we have Chapter 14 with no Jon Hamm again. Chapter 15 has Part 8, Moral Panic, when we have the witches and the comics code. And then later on, just Jon Hamm narrates over top of the actors talking about what have we learned here. One delusion leads to another. What starts as an egg can become a monster. In Chapter 16, we talk about the cave. This one does not have any title card whatsoever, but would be Part 9. The delusion of the narcissist is they believe that they alone are real. Chapter 17 and 18 have no Jon Hamm narrations at all. And the last episode, Chapter 19, has the little clip where they repeat the egg thing from the very first episode, what begins as an egg, and then has this series of title cards. So it isn't actually a Jon Hamm narration because no one narrates those cards, but it feels like the conclusion of this group of things where for what is normal is that which upon 9 wise men can agree, leaving the 10th to swing from the hangman's rope.
Right.
So that's just the rundown of all the Jon Hamm narrations. Now, we can talk about what all they have in common. What exactly are they trying to say?
I mean, they're all about delusion is what they all have in common, right?
Mm-hmm. They're definitely about, delusion and the nature of reality.
You had, I don't know if you want to put this later, but you had a revelation about the last one that you didn't put into our episode about the last.
Yeah, I can say that now. I was walking. I listen to our podcast sometimes just to hear what we said to make sure I know for the future episodes.
That is maybe I do that too, but is it a sign of solipsistic delusion to spend your life listening to recordings of your own voice in your ears?
I don't always listen to the entire episode, and I often listen to it speeded up. So it's not even my own voice. It's my own voice at like 2 times the speed.
Right.
Anyway,
sorry, I interrupted.
I was listening to myself talk about the end of the last episode, chapter 19, and it clicked on me so hard that I had to run home. I burst into the house, screaming at Paul, "We are the 10th person. We are the 10th person." And what I mean is, in the scene in the last episode where David is on trial and he's in the big ball in the middle of the room, and there's 9 people in that room. There's 8 people surrounding him and him in the middle. And it talks about when 9 wise men could agree, leaving the 10th to dangle from the headman's rope. There's a 10th person in that room, and it is the audience. It is us watching the show. Mm-hmm. We are the 10th person in that room, and I think that's deliberate. I think that this whole Jon Hamm narrations are all leading up to we are part of this show. Our madness, our collective consciousness is part of Legion.
And that's why I wanted you to say that before we kind of dug into the Jon Hamm narrations, because I think it's kind of an important key for understanding them.
Yes, absolutely.
We started the very first one in our first episode about the narrator is talking to us. Mm-hmm. The narrator is not a character in the sense of a fictional construct talking to another fictional construct. He's talking to us, the audience, about madness. And the title card, Welcome to Madness, or the narration, Welcome to Madness, mm-hmm. Is directed to us. Mm-hmm. So the season, is more than just depicting someone else's madness. As season 1, we kind of experienced David's madness vicariously. But in season 2, we're really invited to experience our own madness.
Yes.
To exactly. Think about our own madness or sanity. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the fundamental thing that the narrative voice does, is not only explain David's experience or Sid's experience or any of the characters in the frame. It kind of does and provides a context, and we could talk about what that is. We've kind of mentioned that through the show, and I don't think it would be bad to rehash it a little bit. But I think what really the narrator does that couldn't be done without the narrator is involve us, the viewers, in that. Mm-hmm. And the final piece where there are 9 wise people and 1 crazy person in that room, and which one is which.
Yeah, exactly.
We are invited. The 9 wise people are the 9 people who agree that David is villainous, and the 10th hangs from the hangman's rope because he's condemned by all the 9, including us, who are in the room, who all agree that he has gone off, that he's become villainous by the end of the show. Mm-hmm. But the narration also says, what if the ship of fools is the ship of fools? What if we're the mad ones? And we are encouraged to be part of the show, to be part of considering delusion and madness and what can we trust of our own judgment and our own sanity.
Absolutely. It's definitely an invitation to madness all the way along. And even this is most apparent, to me at least, in that episode where it's "this will make you vomit, this will make you vomit," and they say it over and over, and you really feel that physical reaction. You're actually physically reacting to what is on the screen, and maybe not everyone is, but I don't doubt that a lot of people feel just a little bit like vomiting when they hear that over and over. And this is just part of like this fully interactive experience watching this show, is you feel like you're part of this madness, and parts of it, like having part Contagion 5.
Yeah.
Makes you, and having half of these not have title cards at all, makes you go like, wait, what happened to one? What happened to, what part are we at? It's chapter half the time. Like, it's not clear.
I was thinking, like, this is partly about reality and madness and the experience of the real, but it's partly a meta-commentary on storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And I've thought long and hard, the season finale at chapter 19, one of the reviews of it that I read the title of but didn't read the whole review was said something about this show has gone beyond Brechtian in alienating the audience.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a bad review. And I was like, you realize that Brecht was a visionary in the world of theater.
Yeah.
And that for someone like Noah Hawley, who I know is, you can tell by the references that he makes that he really is familiar with and admires modernist drama and existentialist philosophy and all. Comparing him to Brecht, he would not take that as an insult.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's something about the Jon Hamm narrations about for a delusion to thrive, other more rational ideas must be destroyed. I wonder if there's something about the artistic statement of this season that the more conventional narrative beats must be destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
So in order for this show to be delusional, in order for this show to kind of give you the experience of delusion, of madness, the other more rational storytelling approaches need to be destroyed, like that your protagonist is the hero.
Yeah.
Like that you know who the show is about.
Yeah, absolutely. Right? And even that, like, that there's going to be one of these in every episode.
Yeah.
No, there isn't. It's in a little more than half the episodes. And I kind of wanted to mention the episodes that it's not in are chapter 12, which is the episode that focuses exclusively on Sid and in her mind.
Right.
Chapter 14, which is the David Multiple Worlds episode. Chapter 17, which focuses a lot on Melanie and then a little bit on Lenny as well. And then chapter 18, which is basically part one of the finale. Kind of broken, and it's all the desert parts before.
Yeah.
So I feel like that one doesn't quite fit the pattern, but the other ones are when it's focusing on one specific person, when it's their story, we don't get an overarching narration. We get it more when we're trying to tell a grander story.
Right.
And to invite you into this. It isn't about you in those episodes, it's about them. You, the audience, I mean.
Yeah. Okay.
But I really feel like a lot of it just hinges on that first moment with you are inside the maze.
Yep.
You've pictured a maze, and the maze itself is in your mind. Welcome to the madness. And that just, like, defines the entire season.
I absolutely agree.
Which, does that segue us nicely into the motifs?
I think it does.
So, mazes are a strong and, as well as not just mazes, but liminal spaces.
What does that mean?
So by liminal spaces, I mean the in-between spaces, that moment between waking and sleep, that moment, the traveling between things is kind of a liminal space. It's a not quite here and not quite there. And so in Legion, you have literal liminal spaces, which are a lot of hallways. A lot of action in Division 3 happens in the hallway. So it's not in any specific room, it's in the in-between space.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of things happen in dreams, but not quite dreams because it's the astral plane, sort of. And then it's also within the maze, and mazes are these like spaces that are in between, and you're not quite at a destination, and you're not back where you were, and you have to be stuck in this liminal space.
And it's important. Mazes can represent a lot of things, but the mazes in Legion are first introduced in that Jon Hamm narration where he makes it really clear there's a goal in the center. Mm-hmm. There's a beginning and there's a center.
Yeah.
That kind of maze, if there's a beginning and a center, then the rest of the maze is this liminal in-between space.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Is that not all mazes are necessarily that kind of liminal, but they really establish the maze as an in-between space that you're staying in the meantime.
And I feel like there's a couple of things we could say about mazes and liminal spaces for the show as a whole, for the season as a whole,
mm-hmm.
that I think the season itself is a maze.
Yep.
The season itself takes you down this path and twists and turns and dead ends. Like, I think that the weird creature, alien thing...
We think he's a brood.
Brood, that's what we thought it was, maybe, yeah. I think he's a dead end.
Yeah.
I think you thought that trail led to something, but no, you're just at the end of the maze and you need to turn around and go the other way.
I think you're totally right. And if you think of the season as a maze, it makes a lot of the things that people found frustrating about the season. You might still be frustrated by them, but you see them in a different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
That what you expect out of a serialized story is a straight line, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you expect it to go off on little tangents and then return to the main line. But if this season is a maze, then we're going off in different directions. We're going around in circles. We're ending with dead ends. Something's happening somewhere else that we don't even know about, that we then we then see a different perspective on the maze. And I think that is very much a deliberate choice.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, it can be a choice that doesn't work for some people. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it comes back to this, like, the experience of disorientation and madness that this show is not giving you what you have been taught to expect from a show.
Mm-hmm.
Or from a story in general.
Yeah. And I'm wondering if even this season as a whole is a liminal space between season 1 and season 3. And we'll find out with season 3 if that's true.
That's exactly where I was going to go next.
Yeah.
That I, like, not just a maze, but a liminal space. If there's 3 seasons, which there might be 10 seasons, but we have said several times that, like, in our interview with Jeff Russo, he said that he was given a storyline for 3 seasons worth to build musical cues out of, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is an in-between season. And people devalue the liminal spaces, the in-between season, I know people who talk about Lord of the Rings, for example, like the Two Towers is the one where everything is just waiting and then the plot starts again.
Mm-hmm.
But the second in a trilogy, or the middle part, where things are developing, there's a real pleasure in that.
Mm-hmm.
If you allow it to be what it is. Right?
Yeah.
And stories are made out of a beginning, a middle, and an end. People sometimes, myself included, we sometimes want to skip the middle part.
Mm-hmm.
Set everything up, then tell us how it ends. But the middle part is where the story really is.
Yeah.
But it can be also frustrating. It's this liminal space where, like, we don't seem to really be moving forward. And that comes back to the maze. We're going around in circles. We're not sure Like, are you bringing us somewhere?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's my experience with part of this season has been like, where are we going with this?
And even the switch to kind of bring up another motif, the switch that they made from the background is full of circles to the background is full of hexagons.
Yep.
Is now this smooth shape has sides. This smooth thing that we've figured out what this show is about, now suddenly there's corners on it. Now you're turning a corner again and again and again.
Yep.
To get to back to the same place.
Yeah, and a hexagon really does a lot of the same things as a maze in terms of these corners and dead ends rather than one single path. Like I said, as we expect out of a story is a straight path. A circle's a straight path. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And if this is the liminal season, the season of in-between, that makes me really excited also for season 3, though.
Mm-hmm. Really excited.
One of the other, speaking of liminal spaces, a lot of the landscape of this season takes place in deserts. A desert is, in its way, also a liminal space. Mm-hmm. Especially metaphorically.
Yeah.
Literally, a desert is a real space. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not an in-between one place and another. It's an end point. It's a place where there is a rich ecosystem. But metaphorically, deserts really are really rich as a kind of a liminal space where nothing is recognized to grow. It feels like nothing lives there. It feels like nothing stops and stays there. Mm-hmm. You pass through the desert on your way to safety on the other side, right?
And even in terms of like metaphor, people talk about, I'm gone through the desert, but now I've reached the other side. I've reached the oasis. I've reached, yeah.
And before this season started, I forget now who, probably Noah Hawley, someone said in an interview, like, there's a reason why season 1 was in a rainforest and season 2 was in a desert. Mm-hmm. They moved to film in LA so that they could be in a desert instead of in the rainforests of BC.
Yeah.
Temperate rainforest. And a desert is like, yeah, if season 1 was about growth, because it's in a forest where there's lots of green growiness, and it metaphorically is about David and Sid especially, but all the characters kind of growing into something. Season 2 is about a desert where it seems like nothing is growing. Where a lot of the time, what seemed fertile isn't, what seemed like one thing isn't, and there's a lot of the season where David develops his powers, but emotionally, is he growing? I don't think he is. He's stagnating more. Mm-hmm. Right? And we see that by the end of the season. And their relationship, Sid and David's relationship, was really growing in season 1. And in season 2, the primary landscape is a desert.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a very barren time in all of their lives. I think especially like Melanie is going through a terrible time. So another thing that we see throughout the season that I just want to draw attention to, I don't have a lot to say about it, but Sid's compass. Mm-hmm. That he gives her this compass in the first episode. And then she uses it once to find him, but she's always wearing it. It's just this ever-present thing that, and I feel like it's significant when she wears it and significant when she doesn't wear it. And so one of the first future Sids we see, she's wearing it. And then later on, different future Sids aren't wearing it. And I wonder if that's like a clue to us that this isn't the same Sid, that the universe is in flux. that the universe can be changed.
Yeah.
And I have a lot of questions surrounding her compass. Do you have any thoughts about it at all?
I think visually it symbolizes their connection. But it's an interesting, like a compass is an interesting visual symbol of their connection because it actually doesn't suggest that they have a connection.
Yeah, just that she can find him.
That they could have a connection, right?
Yeah.
A compass is kind of in its way a liminal object.
Yeah.
You use it to find your way. If you have found your way, you don't need it.
Yes, that's so true. Liminal object is a great way of describing it.
So at the same time as the compass symbolizes their connection, it also symbolizes their separation. And it, as long as she's wearing it, there's a visual marker of one or the other of them being lost and lost to each other. But then there's also this sense of wanting to find each other, her wanting to find him, and especially future Sid. When we look back at future Sid, knowing everything we know by the end, and frankly, we get a lot of these clues even in our very first or very second appearance of her. But if David is a villain, who's a monster, who she's afraid of, she still has the compass. And practically that compass in the future might be like a warning system so that they can run away from him. But symbolically, it still means her trying to find him.
Yeah. Exactly.
Right? So in addition to it being a different timeline, it also just symbolically means that no matter how divided they get, she still is seeking him. At the same time as it suggests that no matter how together they are, she hasn't found him yet. We have one of the other motifs that comes up through the season, and this is one that I'm not sure how much I have to say about it, but I wanted to bring up. It's just masks. And this is we don't see, I'm trying to think as I talk, I don't think we see literally any. We certainly don't see many literal masks.
Oh, well, the Minotaur.
Is he wearing a mask?
Or is that his head?
Yeah, that's my question.
I thought it was a mask, but now when I think about her holding his head, that maybe it's his head.
Regardless, we don't see a lot of literal masks. Maybe we don't see any. But we do talk about masks a lot and have the idea of masks and have... So masks are a motif that this season is interested in. And it's, David starts by saying Farouk in the first episode of the season, he's talking to Ptonomy and he's like, I don't even know what Farouk looks like. He wears so many masks. And then when Lenny shows up, he's like, are you, you tormented me? And she's like, I was just a mask. And the Shadow King accuses David of wearing a mask, drop the mask. And at the end of the season, when the Shadow King is in Shadow Melanie is telling Sid that, you can see a glimpse of his real face. And then Sid is all, now I see your real face, you hide it so well. And there's this sense of real faces and hidden and masks, right?
Well, the one we forgot to mention, Fukuyama.
Oh yeah,
has a mask. His whole head is a mask.
So,
and maybe that's the contradiction there, is we don't ever see what the way we do eventually, but we don't see what's under the basket for so long. But then when we do, it wasn't really hiding anything.
Right.
It's just basically to keep his head still or whatever.
We can speculate, but yeah.
Or to conduct something.
He seems to use it as a screen, but I think that we're getting a little off topic. Because I think he totally is important you're right, for the motif of masks, that we have this primary character whose face we never see. And even, maybe this is stretching a little bit, but the Vermilions with their mustaches are a kind of a mask too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What does all of that add up to? Like this season is very interested in masks, and masks are important symbolically for the season because they're about hidden faces, a truth that's hidden.
Mm-hmm.
And it's different from, like, we could talk about someone showing different faces. We could talk about someone showing different sides of themselves. But the symbolism of masks is not the same as the symbolism of different faces, because it suggests there's a truth underneath that is being concealed.
And that will eventually be revealed.
Right. And then we kind of see with Fukuyama that that's misguided.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least his face is eventually revealed, but once it's revealed, it's anticlimactic.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a question surrounding both David and the Shadow King are the two characters who get the most mask talk. And the question that all the mask talk encourages you to wonder is there a real face?
Mm-hmm.
Because mask as symbolism suggests, yes, there's a real face. Eventually you'll pull away the mask. You'll see what's true underneath.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure that is... Yeah, I'm not sure that well, I'll definitely say, I don't think that in real life, people are like that. I don't think in real life, someone who behaves differently in one circumstance and another is wearing a mask in that sense. Like, people are complex and nuanced, and they can be actually genuine while still being self-contradictory.
Yeah.
So in the show, Sid ends the season having concluded that David's true face is evil and that his kind face was a mask.
I think it's more complicated than that.
I want to say it's more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm. I think the reveal of Fukuyama being not really anything under his mask was a reveal that masks don't actually matter.
Right.
So moving on from masks to other things in these episodes, you wanted to talk a bit about eggs?
Yeah, this is another one that, like, just because it is an image that comes up through the whole season, and I'm bringing it up without knowing beforehand what I want to say about it, just that I want to say something.
Well, an idea begins like any other whatever, like an egg. Like, it's this idea of birth.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about that in one of the episodes, that coming out of this tunnel was a metaphor for birth. And eggs are definitely this metaphor for birth and new life and beginnings.
Yep.
And this whole season has been about this birth of madness, of delusion, of something different. And the egg, I think, represents and symbolizes all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
And the delicacy of it. They can crack so easily.
Yeah.
And you have Farouk's coffin looking like an egg.
Mm-hmm. In terms of, like, what's important textually, what the narrator tells us is important about an egg is that on the outside, you can't tell what's inside.
Mm-hmm.
Right? An egg is perfectly formed. Frankly, an egg is extremely aesthetically pleasing as an object.
Yes.
But there's something inside, and you don't know what. And I was thinking about, like, the symbolism of kind of potential of turning into something, growing. Like, we could say an egg is about, like, there's this whole future creature locked up inside.
It's another liminal object.
It is. It is. We could say the same thing about, like, a seed.
Mm.
But we don't have any seed metaphor in this whole season.
No.
We have eggs.
We have eggs. Eggs are living.
Yeah. Seeds are sort of living.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm trying to, without knowing where I'm going with it, I'm trying to pick apart, what does an egg do for us that a seed wouldn't? Because we don't want seeds, we want eggs.
Mm-hmm. I think an egg has a living, breathing creature inside of it.
Yep.
Whereas a seed does not. A seed has potential.
Mm-hmm.
But a seed can do all sorts of things. Whereas an egg does one thing. It births a creature.
Right.
It hatches a creature, I suppose. And what does Farouk's egg coffin do? It hatches a creature.
And I like what you said about delicacy of the shell, too.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that I don't think you get from a seed. And we already have the metaphor in our language of a bad egg.
Mm-hmm.
We have a metaphor in our language of bad seed, too, I guess.
Yeah. Whoops.
Anyway, we don't have to belabor it. I just wanted to bring it up and pick at that image a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Also, another image that we have quite a bit of in this season is caves. There are a lot of caves in this season. What's up with all the caves?
Once again, a birth metaphor?
I think so.
Sometimes literally.
Right?
A lot of the times literally. No, only one time literally. Sorry, I'm forgetting what the word literally means.
Yeah, but often very clearly, very emphatically.
Yeah.
Right? Like the cave that you're talking about that's literally a birth metaphor is when we're in Sid's head and she starts off in a cave and then that's an igloo, but it's a cave.
Yeah.
In terms of imagery, that functions as a cave. And I'm calling the hut that David and Sid are in the desert is also...
tent?
The tent, I mean. It also kind of functions as a cave, I think.
Suppose, yeah.
In terms of the imagery, we have this dark cave. Caves are Ionic symbols. And like eggs, they're about birth and potential, and particularly feminine. And you're in the cave, and we talk about one of the central moments of the season in terms of caves is Plato's cave, the allegory of the cave. And the allegory of the cave, an aspect of the allegory of the cave that we don't usually talk about is just that it is a cave. That it's like this dark hole that you crawl out of into the light where you experience the real world. That's birth imagery.
Yeah.
And that's important. I don't know if Plato, I would not presume to make any claim about what Plato was doing deliberately or not deliberately, but it's useful to understanding the allegory that you go from this infantile state or this embryonic state into real birth, into the real world. You come out of the cave into the light, right? And that's another thing that this whole season is doing is we're coming out of someplace safe. Caves aren't necessarily liminal, but cave doors are. And doorways are.
Yes.
And we're really spending time in the tunnels of the cave and out the cave door and going the camera through the cave door. And maybe that's why I want to call the tent that they're in a cave, because we're really looking through the doorway into it. And in terms of the visual experience, there's a real mirroring of how they film us going into caves.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
There's a lot of visual callbacks in this over and over again. And one of them is, this going in and out of spaces like that. Yeah.
So one last image or motif that I wanted to focus on is in season 1, we spent an awful lot of time talking about wardrobe and clothes and what people wore. We have barely talked about that at all this season.
It hasn't been nearly as obvious this season to me.
There's one aspect of wardrobe that has been very conspicuous this season, I think, and it's David's pants.
His little short pants?
He wears short pants. Like, you can see his ankles. They're not long enough for him, right?
I mean, yeah, those are fashionable. People wear those kind of pants.
Yeah, okay. When I say they're not long enough for him, but they're visually remarkable.
Yes.
And people remark on them, right? Like, there's someone that we follow that follows us and we follow on Twitter whose Twitter name is David Holler's Pajama Pants.
Yep.
Right? Because the pants are memorable and distinctive. I think they symbolize that he doesn't... I mean, I think that they, despite being actually fashionable, and when I say, like, they don't fit him, they actually are the right size for him. Like, it's not like the wardrobe department picked the wrong size. And people in the real world wear pants that are that length on purpose. But the visual effect is that he's wearing pants that don't fit him. Mm-hmm. He's the wrong size for what he's trying to be. He doesn't fit in how, and these are clothes that Division 3 have given him. Remember? Yeah. He shows up and Sid says, there's clothes for you. And he puts them on, and there's the pants that he wears for the rest of the season. So the Division 3 is trying to dress him up. Sid is trying to dress him up in something that doesn't fit him. Mm-hmm. There's also a sense of him being unprepared. Him being unequal to the task that's before him. Because he's not wearing what he needs to be. He's not totally fully dressed. Mm-hmm. Because his ankles are bare. Mm-hmm. And it's a subtle... Like, it's a subtle amount of not dressed. Mm-hmm. But it's there. In his visual... the visual language of his wardrobe says, this is a person who is not adequately attired, who is not adequately prepared, who is trying to fit into something he doesn't really fit into, who isn't who people think he is, doesn't fit, isn't the size, the shape, the person that the people around him, the people who are dressing him, including himself, think he is. There's a lot of visual symbols of he isn't who you think he is in those pants.
He's also just like, he's gotten too big for his britches.
Yeah, that too.
He's too big.
He's too big.
He's overreaching. He's over who knows what.
And the Shadow King keeps telling him, like, don't sit at the kiddie table. But we might use that different language for that same attitude. Might be like, put on your big boy pants, David. Right?
Yep, exactly.
He is not wearing his big boy pants.
Nope. Any other motifs you want to mention before we move on?
That about covers the ones I specifically wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are more that if you, our listeners, noticed some image that came up again and again, like, we could keep up the conversation on Twitter. We'd be happy to. Those are the ones that stood out to me. Mm-hmm. So you want to move on to some of the themes? We may recover some of the same ground. But what I think of as, like, when we're talking motifs, we're talking images or objects that come up again and again that have some kind of meaning we can pull apart. Mm-hmm. When I'm talking about themes, I'm saying meanings that are represented in different images of different kinds, right? So it's kind of the same conversation backwards.
Yeah.
One of the major themes, I think, of this season is madness. Mm-hmm. We've been touching on this already. What is this season telling us about madness?
I feel like it's telling us something different than the first season.
I agree.
Because this season is more, David doesn't believe he's mad anymore. And it took me a while to kind of catch on to that in this season, that he thinks he's sane. He thinks he's sane with powers. But he's clearly not. And he's got these voices in his head that are talking, and he's just kind of going along with it, and he doesn't. And so we have a different kind of madness from David where he's not acknowledging it.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, we have an invitation to madness for us as the audience to say, well, maybe you're not as sane as you think you are.
And that also, like, that was present in season 1, but it's a lot more overt in season 2.
Mm-hmm.
And again, in season 1, David was textually, like, worried that maybe he really was crazy after all.
Yeah.
And everyone was always reassuring him, no, 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 no.
Yeah.
You're definitely not. And we have that inversed, especially by the end of the season, where he has come very solidly to the perspective that he is sane. And all the people around him are like, wait, our bad.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is partly a narrative movement, but it's also, like, in terms of theme, it really is emphasizing the instability of madness as an idea. And the show textually does by the end of the season, by, like, how do you know that the ship of fools wasn't the ship of, that we're not the ship of fools? What's mad is what not, or what's real is what 9 wise men can agree on. The show ends by kind of saying madness is just social outlying, which is a little bit what Sid said to David back in Clockworks in season 1. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like Einstein and Picasso were also outliers. But by doing this across the 2 seasons, the show is really making implicit argument that madness is not objectively the case. Right?
Yeah.
It's contingent. It's up for interpretation. Whether something is mad or sane or not is up for interpretation. Is a matter of consensus rather than a matter of objective reality.
Mm-hmm.
Which brings me kind of to a second theme that I think it makes sense to discuss right alongside madness. And that's the major theme of season 1, I think, was reality. And here we're talking reality again, but from a different perspective. And the relationship between reality and madness is very intertwined in this season.
Mm-hmm.
I think one way that I think of it to myself is that season 1 was about ontology and season 2 is about epistemology.
By which you mean?
Ontology is the philosophical study of what is.
Mm-hmm.
So reality, what is actually is, that's ontology. Epistemology is the philosophical study of what is known. So if season 1 was about what in fact is, what is the reality? And so a lot of what we saw in season 1 was stuff that didn't seem like it could be real, but turned out, yes, this is real.
Mm-hmm.
Stuff that seemed symbolic and then turned out to be literal. In season 2, we're much more concerned with how can you know that what you're seeing is real? What the reality is, yeah, okay, that's secondary for the concern of this season, which is, but how do you know that it's real? And that's why we're concerned with the kid who's taught wrong and thinks red is green. And that's why we're like, that isn't about reality is unsteady. That's about knowledge is unsteady.
Mm.
And that's why we have the story of Zhang Zhu is not the standard version of that story of a Chinese monk who dreams he's a butterfly. I said this when the episode aired, but I'll say it again. In the standard read of that story, that's a story about reality. About the monk never knows what's true because reality is contingent.
Mm-hmm.
As it's told in this show, the monk is a monk. It's a delusion. He doesn't know whether he's a monk or a butterfly, But that's because he's delusional.
Mm-hmm.
The show never suggests that he might actually be a butterfly.
Yeah.
Even though that's the core of the story as it's usually told.
Mm-hmm.
Is that he might actually be a butterfly. There's no way for anyone to know. But the show isn't, this season anyway, is much more concerned with what's known than with what is.
Mm-hmm.
And that is connected to madness. It's the sense of being unable to reliably know what's real is what madness is for this show. Right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's what this show means when it says madness.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes to both our experience of the show and the characters' experience of the show by the end of the season. We don't know, either as characters within the show or as viewers, like, really anything by the end of the show.
Yeah.
Is David now the villain and Sid now the hero?
Are they all somehow under Farouk's spell? Because Farouk is just there, unchained and fine.
Yeah, and that
so is that
really
somehow
sense.
Yeah, including not just fine, like unbruised.
Yeah.
So is he somehow manipulating all of them to manipulate David in this way? Is this all his master plan?
Or is he another, like there are multiple Davids? Is Farouk, who was a part of David, now a alternate personality of David?
Mm-hmm.
Is he real and present in the same way that the alternate Davids were? And the actual body of Emil Farouk is either still in his cage or like dead.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting thought.
And the point is that we don't know and can't, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's that unreliability of the narrative that is exactly what makes this show Brechtian. That is what's meant by Brechtian. You're showing us this play for Brecht, but this TV show that alienates the viewers so that we don't know how to interpret what we're seeing. The experience of alienating the viewers is an experience of making them question what is known and what is knowable. That's what this season is very interested in from beginning to end.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So what other themes did we want to talk about overall?
The season, I think, like the first season, is also very much about love.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly about David and Sid's love.
Or lack thereof.
Or lack thereof. The nature of... I mean, and Melanie and Oliver's love is the parallel throughout this season.
Mm-hmm.
And it feels like one of the thematic thesis statements for this show was the one in the episode that's in Sid's mind where she says, love isn't going to save us, it's what we have to save.
Yeah.
And the show keeps coming back and again and again to that statement for the rest of the season. And I don't know, when the season is over, I don't know how we want to now interpret that. Because just because Sid says it doesn't mean it's true.
Also, David's whole, if his delusion is that he is a good person, he deserves love, then is like, love is what we have to save, but David cannot be saved because he doesn't actually deserve love? Or does he?
And is love a matter of desert?
Yeah. Desert?
I said this in our episode about Chapter 19, but I don't think that, I think that is a category error. Mm-hmm. I think that putting those two things together is a philosophical mistake.
Yeah.
And people don't deserve love because they're good.
Yeah.
And they don't not deserve love because they're bad. That's just not how love works.
Mm-hmm.
Or desert. Or goodness. Or value. Anyway,
So does David turning evil or whatever he does by the end make him not have saved love? If love was what they had to save?
It's the question that when Sid says, like, love is what we have to save, but I'm not sure that's what he's doing anymore. What does it practically look like to save love rather than to count on love to save you?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of, like, your actual actions, what is the difference between those two things?
I'm not sure. I feel like it's to save love, they need to do evil things sometimes. They need to kill people. But then she goes
like
against...
It's what she's saying at that time.
Yeah, but then when it comes down to it, she is disagreeing with herself. That she doesn't think the ends justify the means.
Because the easy interpretation of what it means that love will save us is, if we ignore the Shadow King and just spend time together, everything will be fine. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so Sid's lesson of love isn't what saves us, it's what we have to save, would seem like it reverses that and says, go off and defeat the evil guy so that when you're all done, we will have each other.
Mm-hmm.
Which then David tries to do, but it's wrong. It turns out not to be what she wants, or it turns out not to be correct.
Mm-hmm.
She was wrong by saying that, or he's misinterpreting what that would actually mean. When she goes off to find him in the desert, she still thinks love is what we have to save, but I'm not sure that's what he's doing, which means that she thinks he has misinterpreted her. Right?
Yeah.
Because he still thinks he is doing that. So what would it mean that love is what we have to save? Is it about motives rather than actions? So if David was doing all the same things, but
his intention was to love.
His intention was to love rather than to get his vengeance. He's telling himself that he's doing this to save love, but he actually is doing this because he really wants Farouk to suffer.
Right.
So it's not, in fact, the actions that are the problem, but the motivation behind them.
Yeah, and that's why he's, in the end, or just before the end, he's upset with himself because he's happy about hurting Farouk.
Yeah.
And everyone's upset about that. I don't think in the end he's going to save love or love's going to save him.
No.
I don't think we're headed in that direction at all.
No, neither do I. And in terms of the love theme, I said that Melanie and Oliver are the obvious counterpoint or contrast or parallel to Melanie and to Sid and David. What does that mean for their ending? Because it kind of seems like for Melanie and Oliver, love did save them.
Mm-hmm.
For certain definitions of save.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I was really surprised by the end that was what happened to Melanie and Oliver, because I really felt like she had given up on him. But in reality, she was loving him all along.
Mm-hmm.
And she wanted him all along, even though she was mad the entire time.
And it was her love for him is what Farouk was able to manipulate.
Mm-hmm.
But it also is what ended up allowing them both to survive.
Yeah.
At the end, right?
For certain definitions of survive.
For certain definitions of survive. Is that how we want to read that ending?
Maybe.
Like, we'll find out in season 3, I guess.
Yeah.
There's a lot. Another major theme of this season is the idea of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And that's connected in some ways, for David particularly, that's connected to the madness theme. That's part of why he relates to reality the way that he does, is because of his trauma.
Yeah.
But throughout the whole season, like, I should maybe just lay out what I mean when I say the trauma theme. But for David, we come back to the idea of, like, the things that Farouk did to him since he was a kid. Things were done to him. That's trauma. something in his past that continues to have an effect on him now.
Yeah.
Then we spend all this time with Sid, and we see a lot of terrible things that she has suffered and survived. And that's trauma. And Sid's reaction to trauma is different from David's. She says it's about surviving and the things that we have survived, and that's what makes us strong. But that's a reaction to trauma. That's a way of interpreting trauma. Clark literally has trauma on his face all the time.
Yes, and is clearly suffering.
And the show is really not wanting us to forget that. And Fukuyama also is kind of, as a character, defined by past trauma. One of the first things we know about Fukuyama is, when we were a boy, they put us in and now we're the machine that bleeds, and the pain was like lightning or whatever he says. Right? And there is a sense by the end of the season that Fukuyama, like, the pain has not stopped. He still is in pain.
Yeah.
Ptonomy has major trauma when he dies.
Yeah.
And then exists in Fukuyama's mind, and like, this is also a kind of loss of self, not just death, but trauma.
I mean, Oliver had the trauma of living in the ice cube for 30 years, and now has the trauma of living with the Shadow King in his head.
And Melanie has the trauma of Oliver coming back and then leaving. And Melanie's whole, like, until we find out that the Shadow King is manipulating her, it is still very easy to read all of what Melanie does in this season as being the result of trauma.
Yeah.
And even after we know that the Shadow King is manipulating her, I said that it's her love for Oliver is what allows the Shadow King to manipulate her, but an equally plausible reading is that it's her trauma. Right? And then maybe the most dramatic example is Lenny and Amy.
Yes.
That Lenny in Amy's body is like a embodied trauma. That she is Amy tortured until she becomes someone else. Is like literally what happened to her, right?
Yeah.
And that's about the idea that pain, both physical and psychological, pain transforms you.
And violating someone's body is some of the worst kind of trauma.
I was just going to say, if there's a matchbook definition of what trauma is, we could maybe do worse than pain transforms you. That's what we mean when we say trauma.
Yeah.
Right? And the episode that's all in David's head is in its way an exploration of the idea of trauma, the idea of an effects of trauma.
Because you see the different paths that all the different kinds of trauma can lead to.
Exactly. What does all of that kind of lead to? Is this season saying anything about trauma, or is it just dramatizing a lot of kinds of trauma?
I think it's dealing with the after effects, almost like PTSD, and what happens after you go through something traumatic, and whether that's things that have happened, last year on Legion, or in their childhoods. There is this strong sense of dealing with those past dramatic things that have happened to them. And whether they can cope or not cope. And I think pretty much all of them cannot cope. Yeah. Maybe Clark is coping best.
Maybe he is.
But I think the rest of them are just straight up not coping.
Yeah. There's an interesting, in a real sense, you said PTSD, the PT is post-traumatic.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, post-trauma is a liminal space.
Yeah.
Trauma is a thing that happens. Post-trauma isn't a thing. it's a thing that's after a thing.
Yeah.
Right? By definition, which doesn't mean a person who has PTSD isn't liminal entirely, but the PT aspect of that is you're after something.
Yeah.
And maybe there's going to be an endpoint where you're not PT anymore. You're something else. But PT is you're in this in-between space. And if this is an episode about post-trauma, about dealing with trauma, recovering from trauma, or trying to or failing to, that comes back once again to this sense of liminality through the season.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
We're very through the season, as we were through last season, we're very interested in the idea of good and evil.
Mm-hmm. And of what comes in between them.
Yeah.
Like, David is very interested in, and Farouk is very interested in, like, hero or villain. You're one or the other, but and this binary thing, and we have binary moments in the season where we have things written in binary all over the walls. But we also know that it's not binary.
Yeah.
And we know that it's not just this one or the other thing.
Absolutely. And I think one of the central things this season is doing with the idea of good and evil is exactly that, complicating the easy understanding of those as a light switch.
Mm-hmm.
And by making your hero the villain by the end of the season, you're exploring this idea of, is that even possible? In the sense of, can someone go from being good to being evil? I think the show is trying to say no.
Mm-hmm.
Neither Farouk nor David nor Sid are either good or evil. Even Farouk isn't evil, because even Farouk is more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm.
Even though Farouk does evil.
Yeah, and he definitely has moments of, like, talking about having sympathy for your victim or for the villain.
Mm-hmm.
And David doesn't want to hear that, but that does make him sympathetic.
For sure.
It makes David unsympathetic. So one last thing that's looming over the entire season is this threat of the Shadow King. And what did it mean in the first season and what does it mean in this season? Because it's a very different thing this season. It's much more physical, much more concrete. In season 1, the Shadow King was more this, like, metaphysical representation of mental illness. But season 2, he comes in as this more physical, external antagonist. And so we have much more of a traditional superhero interaction here.
Yeah.
But we also have just a different way of looking at a threat.
And that's interesting. If the Shadow King in season 1 was essentially an internal threat, and in season 2 he's essentially an external threat, in one sense you would expect that to simplify the lines of conflict and the good and evil nature, because as you said, like, well, now he's outside of David. Now he's the supervillain and David is the superhero, and one of them's good and the other's evil, and they fight until one of them is dead or in jail or whatever. But when you allow a little more complexity, in fact, making Farouk external complicates instead of simplifies the lines of conflict and the moral status of each of them, because Farouk becomes a fully fleshed person instead of just an aspect of David. And a fully fleshed person can do all kinds of evil things, but are nuanced and complex. They just all are. And that also makes David, at the same time as we might expect it to be, now he's the superhero who can go around doing good. What the actual effect is, now he's a complete human who has to take responsibility for his moral failings.
Yes.
Right? Neither David nor the audience is really prepared for that. that, do you have any other major themes that you were hoping to talk about?
I think that's pretty much it.
So let's call this the end of part 1 of our season wrap-up. Next week, we will have part 2 of our season wrap-up, and on that, we will talk about all the characters and what we think has happened to each of them throughout the season. We'll talk about favorite moments and our predictions, unless that goes too long and there's a part 3.
I doubt it. That'll be shorter than this.
If you didn't get a chance to and have thoughts about the season that you want to share or insights that you'd like us to hear, you can send those to us on Twitter at ClockworksCast. You can send them by email to clockworkscast@gmail.com.
If you're listening to this on Patreon, you can comment below this episode in the comments section. And you can also find us on Reddit and Facebook using the links in the show notes.
If you like what it is we do here, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/clockworkscast. And if you want to leave us a rating and a review, that would be absolutely fantastic, and we would be grateful for it. Until next week, I've been Paul Moffat.
I've been Jan Moffat.
Goodbye.